Welcome to everyone joining us for the second session of the day. Hopefully, you were all enthralled by the keynote as we were. And for those of you who were in a session that Steve did with Jen earlier, this content will help complement some of the information there. So it's not redundant with that information, but it's a nice complement to thinking about what PBIS looks like in the current context. So I am delighted to be able to share this presentation with Steve Goodman. He and I have been doing a lot of work together on thinking about how to support states, districts, and schools during the initial return to school, and especially in the current phase that we're in for however long it lasts. So thinking about kind of the during and the after of a global pandemic, as the title suggests, but as we've talked about the lessons we're learning now, we think about them being applicable to many different contexts and crisis level situations, whether they're natural disasters or civil unrest or violence within a school building. So really thinking about these as lessons that we've learned in the past, and we're going to unfortunately continue to learn as schools go in and out of different situations. So as you've seen in all of our sessions, we're going to start out with some reminders and expectations. Since you have seen them before, I'm not going to walk you through all of them, but I wanted to highlight 2 or 3 things for you. So one is the first expectation around being responsible. In this session, we'll talk about some action items. And so having a template open that you like, or we'll suggest a couple resources during our portion, to just take notes of things you want to remember, things you want to kind of make sure get onto your shared action plan would be a really helpful thing, I think, for you and your team. Second thing is we have added, and give Steve credit, Steve has added some polls to the polls tab. So you should see chat. You should also see a polls tab. That's a place that you can do open-ended questions for us, which we'll address at the end of the presentation. But it's also a place where we'd love to get some feedback from you on what resources have been helpful. For those of you who might be less familiar with the resources, you can pause on doing those and do them after I stop talking. But for those of you who already are familiar with some of the resources from the center, feel free to do those polls at any time. And last thing I'll highlight, and you'll hear throughout each session, is we use data to guide our decision making. So evaluations are always important, but especially because this is our first ever virtual forum, we'd really love feedback and input into what's going well and what we can do to enhance and improve across time. So with that, hopefully you're all here because you've found us, right? So just be aware of making sure you're set up to find things tomorrow as well. And as you've already seen, because you've likely been in a couple of presentations, each session has details. And then as you see on the screenshot, there's a chat pod, a polls pod, people, so you can see other participants, and the files for each session should be uploaded. So the presentation file we're using right now is uploaded and available. So if you want to download that, you are welcome to do that at any point in time. And this will continue to be available after the presentation, including the video of our presentation, which we hear is going to be available as soon as 10 minutes after we wrap up. So that's kind of an exciting feature of this application. So in our content, we're going to ask you to use chat to engage, share examples with each other. Steve and I are going to monitor chat when the other person is talking. So right now, Steve is on it, and when he starts presenting, I will be in it. And again, use the questions and answers to ask questions that you'd like us to answer live. So the chat will maintain throughout the session, but the question and answer part are things we'll highlight live. And we'd, again, love your feedback through the polls. So one caution, which maybe you've already done, and I certainly have myself, if you click other places within Pathable, it takes you away from the session. So no big deal, you can come back in, but it's probably better to be careful about where you click while you're watching the session. If you run into tech issues, Anthony from University of Oregon is on. He will help solve them in chat, but there's also a help desk you can go to. So with that, I'm going to bring us into our current session and content. So Steve and I are going to talk with you for the next hour and 15 minutes roughly about kind of the current context and how we leverage what we already have in place in terms of practices and systems to support our implementation. So Steve gets credit for the Fortifying the Framework title, but I think it's a really nice way to think about this session is how do we not, again, throw things out, do brand new and different, but really think about strengthening, enhancing, or fortifying the work that we already have in place. Throughout the session, we'll each share some resources, and so likely we'll put links into the chat pod, but all the links are also in the PowerPoint presentation, so you can come back to those. We'll also show you where they live on the website, which is right here. So on pbis.org, our main National TA Center website, we have a dedicated page. It shows up in the announcement bar after the announcement about the forum. And when you click on that, it brings you to this page that has the return to school guidance that we're going to talk about. It also, if you scroll down, has information for states and districts, schools and classrooms, and families and students. So specifically, there are practice briefs, there are videos that you can download and watch, there are action planning templates, and there are other types of resources that we link to. We'll continue to develop and grow those resources across time. So one of the things we are asking in the polls is to get some feedback on what's working and what you still need. So the specific resource I want to highlight is this one called Returning to School During and After Crisis. And I keep saying that we're now kind of kicking ourselves because the returning to school gives this implication that it's just for now. And we really thought about this resource, and you'll see the content is developed to help carry us through this entire situation. So both for folks that are initially going back, whether going back means into remote, or you've been remote, you're going back to hybrid, or you're going back full time to in-person. But it also talks about what we need to do once we are back in whatever learning mode we're in, and how we then think about kind of sustaining some of that implementation that's enhanced across time. And one of the things that I've learned from working with Steve over the years is the importance of looking outside of our own areas of expertise to learn from others and to think about how we can integrate practices across different domains and disciplines. So we were fortunate to be able to partner with the SysUp Center that many of you already know and love for their work in helping states scale up and districts scale up evidence-based practices. We partnered with the newly emerging National Integrated MTSS Research Network, and also with two of the national leadership groups focused on literacy. So you'll find recommendations in this guide, not just from kind of traditional PBIS that looks at behavior, social emotional learning, and mental health, but also extends into the academic domains to really think about how we leverage practices across those areas. So we are all living together through the current climate and context, but recognizing we have friends from across the country and across the world in our sessions, I just wanted to give us a little bit of a common kind of starting place with this conversation. So depending on the region of the country or the world that you're living in, you're likely seeing different kinds of headlines. And some of these I pulled a while back, but these are continuing to be headlines that come across. So one of the biggest things that we've learned is the important roles schools have served in our communities, always, but especially in a crisis. So we're watching the pandemic create an economic context and a social context in which many families and children are hungry and worried about where their next meal is coming from. We're seeing lots of concerns in the media about academic loss, so learning loss, and thinking about that impact, especially for students with disabilities or students who are at higher levels of risk for academic failure or academic risk. And again, thinking about what this means as students come back this fall, as students may continue to be remote throughout this year and come back next fall. So we're seeing lots of concerns and angst. And last time I presented this slide, it always gives me pause with just kind of the negatives that we often hear in media. And so I want to pause for a second and also just ask us, maybe in chat, or at least in your head if you're not going to use chat, to throw out some of the celebrations you've seen for people doing amazing work in this context. Because I think one of the things I've been so inspired by since March is how our educators have stepped up and filled needs. I was literally having a conversation with one of our district level administrators who was delivering food to schools while on a systems level conversation about implementing positive and proactive practices within their district. So people just stepping up in amazing ways to do fantastic things. Therapy being delivered on lawns of students, right? Buses going around with wireless to give students access to technology or to internet connection when they don't have it at home. So while the challenges are there, the celebrations of success in spite of these challenges have been very real. The other piece that has really inspired or given me kind of hope in this last while is watching us think about what education can be. So while the pandemic paused and caused a lot of us a lot of stress with going into remote learning that we weren't prepared for, We also have seen many people think about the pause to consider kind of what if, right? What if school didn't go back to normal, but went back to something that was better than normal? And part of that has been our country in the US experiencing the twin pandemics, right? We have the global pandemic that is a health crisis, and that pandemic has shown a light on inequities within our country, not just in health outcomes, which again have been very stark from the pandemic, but in all aspects of society. So, Black citizens, Brown citizens, and people of color and Indigenous folks have had centuries where outcomes have not been equitable, right? Violence has not been equitable. So there is a very different experience in our country for people from certain backgrounds. And because of that kind of pause in our world, this inequity, which is not new, it's been here for centuries, has a different level of attention and focus in the country. And so what that means for our schools is that it's a chance for us to pause, to think about what works and what works for whom. So as we're thinking about the systems that we're investing in and how we're going to pivot them into the new environment, and we're thinking about the critical practices, we're going to look at those practices that have evidence, but also practices that are culturally relevant. And we're going to interrogate our implementation to make sure the implementation and the outcomes are equitable, right? So we're going to be looking at disaggregated data. So to me, these pieces give me huge hope because I feel like we have a moment to reimagine what school looks like for everybody and to make sure that school works for everybody. And by everybody, we actually mean everybody. So kids with and without disabilities, kids from every gender group, kids from every race or ethnicity group. So really looking and holding ourselves accountable to helping students achieve success. So with that, we use that context to think about the guiding principles for our work. And so this picture, for those of you all who have been doing PBIS, should look very familiar to you, and I'm going to blow it up. But one thing that we've done is really thought about equity being in the center of our work as part of this return to school or supporting schools guidance. And so what that means for us is that not just as a word, saying we prioritize it, but really thinking about the multi-tiered system of support, or PBIS, as a means to achieve equity, right? MTSS is for all students. If we think about the core of MTSS, it's looking at prevention practices for all, and then differentiating supports based on need. So for some students, they need just tier 1. For some students, they need tier 1 plus tier 2. And for some students, they need even more individualized or intensive support in tier 3. And if you look in that box, it doesn't just say students, right? So we're thinking about the MTSS logic also being applied for families and for educators. So each of us have experienced this pandemic in different ways. For some of us, whether we're thinking of our role as a parent or a member of a family, or we're thinking about ourselves with our educator hat on, some of us have experienced personal loss. Some of us have experienced folks in our families who have lost jobs. Some of us have experienced this lovely kind of double role of being a parent and an educator at the same time, both for your own kids at home, but also for your students outside of your home. And having been someone who's lived through all of those, I can tell you that coming back into whatever the normal is, it's a different experience depending on what your role has looked like and what your experience has been. So we shouldn't assume that educators and families all need the same. We need different levels of support to help us make it back and be okay. So if we think about the MTSS framework then as a pathway toward equity, it is about disaggregating data, differentiating support, and ensuring that all students have a chance to be successful. And to be able to do that, we then need to prioritize outcomes around student growth. So really thinking about giving all students the opportunity and the access to high quality supports, and looking at data to make sure we're realizing those outcomes for all students. We're going to continue to invest again in evidence-based practices. And this message is not new, but I want to underline it for us. In this context where we are stretched and we are stressed, we cannot do everything, right? You heard George's keynote for those of you who were able to tune in. He talked about the importance of a small number of effective, so evidence-based, and culturally relevant practices that we can do well. And those practices turn out to be the same ones, whether you're coming at this from a PBIS lens or an SEL lens or a trauma lens. Those same core practices are the core practices for all of those frameworks. And the other thing that folks like Steve, again, have continued to emphasize is when we can't do all the things, it becomes even more critical to integrate and align. So if we're thinking about how to support students' social, emotional, behavioral growth, we need to braid that within the context of academic support, right? Those two things are not independent. Those two things are very much together. And especially for students still in remote, it becomes really critical for us to think about creating those meaningful learning, but also connection opportunities for our students. And to make sure that we're doing this well, we have to use data, right? We have to use data to identify who needs what level of support, to think about what supports we're going to target for that student or that educator or that family, to use data to monitor that implementation is going well, and again, going well for all, and that outcomes are being achieved for all. And to make any of this possible, we have to have systems that allow us to support implementation across time with high fidelity, right? So by the time I get to this version of the slide, it feels overwhelming. So I'm going to take all the text away and remind us that we know how to do this, right? This is not a brand new message. This is sticking to the core features of what we know works. It is sticking to those core features within the lens of equity. So thinking about, again, outcomes, data systems, and practices to achieve equitable outcomes for all students. So how do we do that? So one of the pieces that we continue to learn is we can't do this alone, right? We shouldn't be the lone teacher trying to figure all of this out. And I keep using these screenshots of the guide, even though I know you're not reading all the text, because I want you to see that there's so much information baked into this guide that after you leave this talk, you can go and find more. So thinking about what it means to implement within this cascade means that we're considering how each level supports the next level. So thinking about how states can provide policy, guidance, training, support to set districts up for success. How districts can think about the needs of their workforce, how they can make sure that training, coaching, and evaluation are available for schools, and how schools can in turn do that at the school-wide level to support educators in classrooms who then support kids. And when we first developed this graphic, that was the picture we were telling, or the story we were telling with the picture. And our colleagues and friends at SysEp pointed out the importance of feedback loops, right? And as we started thinking about kind of the feedback and the importance of that in every time, we know that it's critical to make sure we're getting stakeholder input. But right now, you've heard me use the word evidence-based probably at least 5 times. And the reality is we don't have a ton of research on what it looks like to implement instruction in a global pandemic. So while we're going to emphasize evidence-based practices and focus on critical features and pivot those into the current context, we also need to be learning together about what actually works under what conditions and for whom. So to be able to do that, we have to have those feedback loops. And I feel like every day, I've shared this example with Steve in the past, every day, one of the feedback loops that I learn the most from is watching my kids and their teachers. So I feel like even this guidance has continued to grow and become enhanced in my own experience and training by learning from that example. And I watch in districts, the same is true, right? Teachers are excellent in different ways. And as we learn from them, we can better build in training and supports for others. And the same is true at the district and state level. So one of the main messages is around leveraging what you have, right? Fortifying your framework. And when we think about what that means, again, this is not new and different. For those of you all who have been implementing PBIS with us, you have seen slightly different versions of this graphic for at least the last decade. I have to now look back and see when we first developed it or when George and Rob first developed it. It's tweaked, it's enhanced, but it's not new and different. That said, what we've learned since March and what we're continuing to learn is that we do need to make enhancements. So as we think about stakeholder engagement, always critical. But folks in public health and school nursing have gained a whole different level of need, experience, respect, of needing to be part of conversations with families, needing to be part of conversations on leadership teams. Our colleagues who are experts in information technology and instructional technology have all of a sudden seen their skills, which were always valuable, as critical. So thinking about which stakeholders are at the table and who's on the leadership team become really important conversations. The other pieces that we've had to look at are what adjustments do we need to make to policies to make sure not only that they're supporting equitable implementation and outcomes, but that they're not inherently setting people up for success. What does it mean to be in attendance or to not be in a remote context? And we have briefs on things like that, right? We're starting to define and learn those pieces together. So as you look through the guide, you will not see brand new and different, but you will see recommendations for how to enhance the systems that you already have in place. And for those of you that were in Steve and Jen's talk, one of the things we've also learned is that where districts and states have these elements in place, and for schools where they have this bottom chunk in place, they've been effectively able to pivot. And for people who are building their systems up, it's been a little bit harder to build in this context. So needing to really focus on how to go back to basics and how to kind of differentiate your own support. So check out their session in the recording, which I think is already available. All right, so I'm going to wrap up with a focus on critical practices. So as we talked about the importance of outcomes, the importance of data, the importance of systems, those are all necessary to allow us to enable a small number of critical practices to be implemented effectively and across time. So in this guide, we've talked about and defined what these practices look like. I'm going to do the fast version, but there's a lot of detail, including clickable resources that can give you a lot more context. And before I introduce the specific practices, I just wanted to reiterate this idea of back to basics. So when we are stretched, when we are stressed, when things feel uncertain, and George talked about this morning when he had his risk versus protective factor balance, some of the tendency is to try and invest in brand new things, scale up, get complex, go fast. And what we've seen is the most effective is going back to basics. So again, investing in a small number of practices that you can do well, implementing them with fidelity, and over time monitoring to adjust based on your own data. So when we held ourselves accountable to identifying 5 critical practices, these are the ones we landed on. So the first one is connecting. And all of us who have been in the field know that relationships are one of the things that often come up. In the current context, this becomes even more critical. Because if you think about the relationships that educators have with families, with students, that students have with each other, those are the pathway to everything else, especially when you are in a remote or physically distanced environment. So really thinking about intentionally building connections and positive relationships, because it doesn't happen by accident, right? We have to model, we have to teach, and we have to provide opportunities to connect. And we can do that effectively in classrooms, even in a remote context, but it doesn't, again, happen by accident. It has to be intentional. We have to have data to guide our practice. And so most of the current recommendations are to really emphasize tier 1, to anticipate that students have had a little bit of learning loss and are going to need a more intensive version of social, emotional, and behavioral support after this pause. But beyond like a specific screener, the idea is then once we've implemented intensified tier 1, how do we identify students, educators, and families who still need more? So think about screening as a process of identifying need and matching need to support, as opposed to thinking about it as something you check off on a list, right? It really is a process for identifying needs and matching support. And speaking of support, our third practice is a pretty big bucket because we put into this bucket of support all of the things that we do to set our students up to be able to benefit from instruction. So thinking about things like creating a safe environment. If we're back in school, we're now picturing what that means in a physically distanced environment where kids are wearing masks and we're maintaining physical distance. But that idea of creating an effective environment also exists in a remote context. So I've, in other places, given really detailed examples of how you can do this in a Google Classroom, right? You can have your Google Classroom set up with your expectations, your routines, those can be explicitly taught. So thinking about whatever environment we're in, how we set it up to be safe and supportive. How we establish, not just identify, but teach the routines students and families need to be successful. How do we teach the expectations that we have that are positively stated in the context of those routines, again, to set students and families up for success? And how do we think about then recognizing when they are being successful? So providing specific feedback, whether it's in a chat, an email, a verbal acknowledgement, a ticket, whatever. And how do we make sure that those positives outweigh the correctives that we likely also need to give if a student is making a mistake? So making sure the positives outweigh the correctives at least 5-1, right? And as we've put those supports in place, we can then more effectively teach in an integrated way with high leverage academic practices and also integrated social, emotional, behavioral practices. And as we are teaching, we're continuing to use data to monitor to ensure that students are being successful and adjust where we need to if they are not. And by doing those practices together, then we can create a positive, predictable, and safe learning environment with the goal of supporting not just students' academics or students' behavior, but supporting all of their needs, right? Their social, emotional, behavioral, academic needs, and really thinking about, again, supporting all students. So if, as I was going through those practices, you weren't sure what they looked like, don't try and read this, you won't be able to. But this is a screenshot that shows you how many hyperlinks there are to resources. So if you're not sure what it looks like to connect, there are hyperlinks to resources that give examples. If you're not sure what a screener looks like and you wanted to think about what that is, we have examples that give more detail. Same thing with how to use a teaching matrix, for example, to teach expectations and routines. The other piece that I want to acknowledge is that guide primarily focuses on tier 1. So what are the supports we need to put in place for all? So there have been 2 resources, one back in May and one more recently, that we've developed to look at what are the needs of students with more intensive behavioral needs or students identified with disabilities, and how can we then intensify these same exact core practices to help provide support for those students. So these guides just go into more depth again about how to intensify. So as I'm getting ready to turn it over to Steve, I just wanted to highlight a couple of other things. We mentioned the importance of action planning at the beginning. So in the guide, there are tables for states, districts, and for schools at the bottom half of the table. They give tips or pointers or considerations for how to enhance these different systems elements and what examples might look like before we go back, during our initial return, and then again across time. And we don't see this being a linear timeline because we anticipate schools potentially moving in and out of going back. So this table is one, again, that I would continue to look back at. Same idea for practices. So we have at the district, school, and classroom levels, suggestions for how we can really emphasize these key practices with examples of what they look like during remote or distance learning and in person. The idea being for those of you in hybrid, you pick from both columns to think about leveraging the practices that work best for in-person or remote. And again, these resources will continue to enhance, revise, develop other resources to support. So we'd love to hear from you in the polls about what works and what you still need. But we hope this is a good starting place. And again, as I'm about to transition, I've said this a few times, but I just wanted to say it one more time, and you have it in a slide to go look back on and remind you. Even though we said we were going to keep it simple with 5 things, I just talked pretty fast about many things. So what I'd like to encourage each of you to do is think about your specific context, whether you're at the state level, district level, school level, and think about the unique needs of your setting. And then from those lists of practices and systems, think about the small number of things that are the biggest priority for you right now. So it is okay, and as the slide says, it's actually critical right now to prioritize a small number of things, do them well, and then move on. So we're not saying only do 3 things, but think about what you can kind of invest in, enhance, do well, and then add as you need to based on data. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and tag Steve in to give some examples of district and state.
Thank you, Brandy. I was just putting in the information of where they can find the resources here. So that's just in the chat. A couple of things. There was some comments, some nice conversation going back and forth around how we need to still be socially connected while physically distanced. And just great comments around that. There was another question, just wanted to bring up around the polling. Within the polls, you can click on where people are entering in chat. If you look at the next tab over, it says polls. And what we're trying to do is collect information around the resources that Brandy's talking about. Like, did you know those resources are available? Have you accessed that, downloaded it? If you have downloaded it, did you actually try it out? And if you tried it out, was it helpful? So just 4 really quick polls, if you could answer that. And Brandy, they should be able to do that anytime, you said, right?
Yeah, they are live as soon as we launch, so they should be good to go.
Okay, perfect. And there was a question that someone had, or somebody had a hand raised in the chat. And would you be able to ask the question within the Pathable chat, and then we can hope to answer that. Just trying to see if there's anything else. Okay, I think that's covered. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And oops, here we go. So you should be able to see. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So a couple of things as we get started here on this section. So just it's such a pleasure presenting with Brandy, because it's her leadership and her guidance that really helped with that section of the website that she's mentioning of all those resources. So just you can see her brilliance when you look at those things. A couple other things. As we move forward, what you should see, we know these are really challenging. Nobody has to tell you, right? These are challenging times. And we know that as complicated the issues are, unfortunately, you're not going to find the answer to it all here, you know, either in our session, even though there's wonderful things here, or at the conference. But what we hope you see is that there are components of the solution being offered here. So just want to keep that in mind as we keep moving forward. So, you know, some interesting things around the idea of what's learning going on. Brandy said, you know, my grandmother talked to me about the flu pandemic that occurred when she was growing up. And we've never faced anything like that, right? As you all know. But I kind of reflect back on what we have learned during this pandemic and implications for our work. And some of the things that we're finding is our programs and systems are not as solid as we might have thought. So we need, as Brandy's talking about, fortifying, we need to revisit these things. And we also are learning that a divided community really diverts energy needed for problem solving. So how do we fortify our systems? How do we leverage and look for our allies to do this work? So what that means is we need to communicate strategically and with transparency. We need to rely on science and evidence to give our best guess of how to move forward and demonstrate and document these successful outcomes. So when we look at the current crisis on our progress, we know there are vulnerable students. If you've been reading anything about the COVID slide, or just how many students are, the gap between those who are doing well and those who are struggling is increasing. So this is really impacting stressors with our current normal. And we can take that same idea and extend it to our education systems, like schools and districts. And we want to make sure, as we mentioned previously, that our systems are not as solid as we thought they were. So how do we make sure we fortify our investments to keep this going forward? And to do that, it's so important because this is the time we need to be supporting students, our families, and our educators. So one thing to consider, so we have our MTSS or PBIS as a multi-tiered framework efforts moving on. And then we've got this COVID approach here, COVID happening, it's happening for us. What we know is the strength of the system provides a moderating effect. So that the better the quality and stability of our systems pre-COVID, the better we are able to keep the systems in place during and after these disruptions. So if you think about this, if we have systems that are not as stable or not mature in the implementation of PBIS, now we're hit with competing demands on priority and focus. Should we put money into training PBIS, or does that money need to go in cleaning, supplies and cleaning help? Do we have less capacity and resources to implement PBIS? And if we are diverting our energies and our capacity, we get poor quality implementation. And poor quality implementation is going to result in outcomes not being realized. Now, the problem with that cycle is now we've got potential for less investment in PBIS. So as we have less investment, it even cycles more. So we really need to look back on our systems, to look at the fortification of it, to look at the alignment so that we can do better, improve. Now, some of you are probably familiar with the SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats. We are playing around with the idea that it's probably best to switch that around and call it a TOES analysis, meaning threats first, opportunities, weaknesses, and strengths, and look at our current normal. And during this time, consider what our threats are. Well, it's the physical distance, it's the intense stress associated with this, it's the illness. As Brandy was mentioning, it's hitting hard with increasing homelessness, with hunger, with just a number of issues that people are dealing with. And so, but there's some opportunities during this condition for us around looking at professional learning that is more tailored to the needs of our staff. Certainly there's weaknesses around the liabilities of we're not set up to do the work the way it is. In Michigan, we are car, manufacturing produced a lot of our work here, and there was a switching over to protective device, personal protective equipment, and that doesn't happen. It takes a while, so there are liabilities that are associated, but there's certainly strengths that we have competent people dedicated to this. So we are suggesting, if you're looking at fortifying your work, it may be helpful to consider this TOES analysis to look at where our strengths and where do we know that we need to improve. So when you think about this, the threats and opportunities are external to the internal of weaknesses and strengths are associated with the district or the state level, wherever you're at. So our consideration for moving forward, for strengthening, for fortifying the work, when we look at the state level, we know that the SEA State Education Agency, plays a critical role in developing and supporting local capacity for a multi-tiered approach, PBIS. That can be implemented well and sustained across the state. But we also have to look at how do we refocus and strengthen our investment in that local capacity to keep this current context moving forward. Prior to the pandemic, we have been working with some districts that were really struggling financially and struggling to keep teachers, without them leaving the district. With the pandemic, it's increasing those, multiplying that tenfold. So as a framework for this, we are suggesting that the closer you are to students, like in a classroom setting, the more you really need to be focusing on educational practices. As you move away to the school level, the district, the region, or the state, the more the focus should be on supporting infrastructure so that we can make sure that those who support kids are supported in themselves to do it well, correctly, and consistently over time. So as a state level, what we're suggesting, either if you are working at the SEA or you're receiving services and supports from the state, consider these 4 items that the SCA, it would be really helpful to provide guidance and direction, information, alignment of policy and procedures for the implementation PBIS. There's also a state level providing resources and materials, certainly downloaded or accessible from websites. Also the coordination. So how do we make connections between state level policy and district level policy in the practices, so that people feel that they know what to do and how to do it. And certainly we need to continue investing in local and regional structures to support, because at the state level, we will never have enough resources to do it all. We have to invest in that local capacity. So as we're fortifying this work, what we're suggesting is, let's consider the role of the school, the district, and the state in things like selection of PBIS or the practices around fidelity. And what we mean by fidelity is implementing correctly and consistently over time. Sustainability. It's not going to be effective in meeting the needs of all students across our state unless it's sustainable. Otherwise, we're just going back and forth trying to implement something and catch it up again. And certainly a scalability. What we're suggesting here is that for the selection of practices, the school has huge influence for that, but because of the contextualization of the needs of the student within that school. But as we're looking at things like sustainability and scalability, much more influence of the state. So when we're talking about alignment, it's always saying, well, there's different functions depending on what level of the cascade that Brandy mentioned. At the student level, it should be a level of analysis. If we are not showing or demonstrating impact on students, then we have to question, what is it that we're doing? At the school, it's our level of implementation. Brandy mentioned the guide that is broken down into, here's what the state can do, here's what districts can do, here's what schools can do. And the emphasis is, how do we have school-wide implementation because it's more effective and efficient moving at school level. Now, at the district or the local education agency, it's certainly where the implementation is provided through management and resources, allocation of supports, policy. And as we move up to the state, it's the coordination of it all, which just ties into what Brandy was mentioning around the cascade. So consideration for you then, if we want educators to implement correctly and consistently, they need supportive environments. And if you think about it, it's the ABCs, the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. For the antecedent, they need to know what to do and how to do it and why they're doing it. For the behavior, they need to have the time to actually engage in the behavior and effective procedures or tools to do it. And finally, for the consequence, they have to know, am I doing it correctly? Is it being acknowledged? Am I given some feedback of how well it is, and can see the impact on students? So if that's what's needed for the individual implementer, then we can go back and say, how do school leadership teams provide that? And then what does district leadership teams do to enhance that support? So it can ultimately get down to educators providing efficient, effective practices. Now, the analogy we like to use when thinking about this for leadership teams is the sailing stones of Death Valley. Maybe some of you have seen this or heard about it. The idea is there's these stones, and pretty good size are out in Death Valley. And you can see from the tracks that they are moving. And there's all kinds of theories, like everything from it's magic to it's aliens or something supernatural happening. But when you look at science of what's happening, when there is ice that's formed and that ice melts just enough, it doesn't take much wind to blow the stones. And the reason why this is an appropriate analogy is that we have to not only look at how do we push the work forward, but how do we remove the resistance to it? And with the sailing stones, we've got the wind pushing it forward, but we also have the resistance removed from, where the stones are sitting on. So in practice, how do we keep moving forward through priority to make sure that people understand that this is the right thing to do, but how do we remove barriers that get in the way? Barriers like, I've got too many assessments to do. I don't have the time to actually do the work, or I don't have the time to meet. So those are all considerations of fortifying the work. Now, as we consider this, we say we need to go back to basics. What's the smallest thing you can do to get impact? And then how do we do it well? George mentioned this, Brandy mentioned it as well. So we select a few practices that we have high confidence based on the needs of our students and the context of the setting. So that is based on a few things here, that teaching and utilizing routines, both social and academic, really have shown to increase positive climates and increase student success during normal times. And this is helpful during these times. It's even more important now because of the uncertainty and the need to create safe, predictable, and supportive environments. So 4 things that we consider for combining together for fortifying our work. The first is effective environments. And we mean these are our school climate that motivates students and educators to be in school, to be in virtual environments and school programming that really promote environments conducive to learning. We also need to consider the social emotional well-being with the idea to address personal challenges that are experienced during education disruptions and to return to school creating a mindset for learning. We also need to look at good instruction. So we could have the very best classroom management, the best PBIS implementation going on, but if we have poor instruction, it's not going to get the results we want. So let's focus on effective instruction that leads to learning that could be, mitigating the effects of COVID. Slide. And finally, during these times, it really brought out more than ever that we need school and home partnerships. We need the family engagement to really help us move forward. So when we look at these things, we know it's all integrated and aligned. For positive environments, we need to identify expectations during our current normal and looking at the different settings. So as we said, we're not used to teaching virtually, or at least many of us aren't. So then how do we help students understand what it means in those settings, as well as a hybrid approach or within the school? Now there's resources for Teaching Matrix that's online. There's also documents that you can download from PBI Center for creating Teaching Matrix or adapting things like check-in, check-out for distance learning. When we focus on social emotional well-being, we really, a component of that is helping students identify their current feelings and emotion. And then how do we address that with coping skills to focus on stress or anxiety being felt and connected to the community? Some of our schools, like in Michigan, we stopped education in March, and then we had a virtual learning or remote learning taking place. So some of our students missed the opportunity to say goodbye to their friends. They have not had that relationship built with new teachers. So it's a lot going on. And the same thing can be said for our adults that we're working with as well. For high leverage practices, instruction, what we are suggesting is use structure and instruction, which would be explicit instruction, using a model of I do, we do, you do. So first the teacher would demonstrate it and the instructor, and then the students would do it with the instructor, and finally there would be an opportunity for the students to do it alone. So it's gradual release of the routines. And certainly we know that the more learning opportunities provided to students, the more opportunity they're going to have to learn. And just providing the opportunities is not enough. We need to provide feedback on that. For the final of the four, looking, because we said promoting effective environments, social emotional well-being, high leverage instruction. The final here is family engagement. We need to make sure we're investing in relationship building, communication, and collaboration. And there's a really nice document that from the PBI Center that was also developed in collaboration in the Center for Parent Information Resources. So we know PBIS is an effective framework to differentiate research-informed practices matched to student need, but it's also an efficient way to allocate those resources because we don't have enough to do everything for everyone. And how do we increase the efficiency through an integrated PBIS approach with effective instruction and social emotional well-being? Now, we talk all the time about layering systems of support, but just one consideration that our tier one supports really have changed now. We need to consider increasing the focus, precision, and reflecting on the needs of all students who missed out on education, programming, and social relationships. So it's our world has changed. We need to look at doing things a little differently, and the opportunity to fortify our work is a helpful component of that. Now, I'm going to stop sharing here and turn it back to Brandy.
All right. I was just taking questions. So what I think I would like to do is do a little bit of wrap up, and then we're going to land on questions. Sorry, I'm playing with files in the background, so not doing a great job of multitasking. Bear with me for one more minute. Oops, not that one. All right, so you all should be seeing my files. Steve, that looks okay? So I always feel so thankful anytime I get to hear Steve talk, because I hear about the kind of critical practices they've chosen to emphasize in Michigan, but also the thinking about the systems that need to be there to support all of those practices. And so I just wanted us to land on a few of the key messages. And as I'm doing this, I reminded you of this in chat, but the way to ask a question is in the polls, which is a little bit funny because it's not how we think of polls. So if you go to the polls tab, the first one, at least that pops up for me, is an open-ended one. Those are questions only Steve and I see, so they're private, and then we'll be able to answer them live. So in terms of the key pictures, again, everything comes back to me to this graphic, right? How do we, whether we're talking at the state level or thinking about programming for an individual student, how do we identify meaningful outcomes? How do we use data to not just kind of target our outcomes, but also to think about what practices are relevant, what systems need to be in place, and how things are going across time? How do we select, identify, and implement evidence-based and culturally relevant practices in a way that students benefit? And how do our systems enable staff to be successful, not just in the moment, but across time to sustain and enhance those practices? And all of that within this context of focusing on equity. So as I said, students being successful, we already talked about the importance of drilling down to look at are all students with and without disabilities, students of various genders, and students of different racial and ethnic groups, are all students being successful. And as you will continue to hear, there's a new tool within the school-wide information system that allows you to do that. So as you're thinking about being able to examine and interrogate your practices, which a couple folks commented on in chat, this tool should enable you to be able to really think about what is working for whom and under what conditions, and then based on that to be able to enhance and adjust your practice across time. So part of the other message we talked about was this figure, again, living at the state, district, school, classroom, and student level. So thinking about the full implementation cascade and the importance of sharing feedback across those levels because we are all learning together. We talked about, as we fortify our framework, investing in the systems that have allowed us to be successful, but enhancing them, right? So not just doing the same things, but thinking about where we need to enhance, tweak, and adjust to meet the current context and the needs of our current population. And to do that, we asked you to think about focusing on a small number of evidence-based, culturally relevant practices, and again, continue to use data to identify who needs what and to monitor what is working and for whom. So we shared this link in the chat, but this page will have all the resources we've mentioned, but we will continue to enhance and develop resources. And so we would love for you to A, check back, but B, in addition to completing the polls, whether it's in chat or in a private email to Steve or I, let us know what your needs are, because we want to be able to be responsive, and we each live in our own context. And so for us, that would be really helpful feedback. This is a slide Steve has shared with us, and thinking about kind of the opportunities of this moment. Again, we started off talking about the context and that the context comes with challenges baked into it, but there are also really hopeful elements of that and an opportunity to, again, rethink things. So to think about if there are features that have not been working, how do we redesign? How do we retool? How do we use this moment to accelerate the idea of an interconnected approach? An interconnected thinking about mental health, social, emotional, and behavioral support, but also academics. How do we look beyond where we are right now in the data we might traditionally have used, whether we're in the classroom or the school, to think about other data sources that we need in a more community-wide approach when schools have become the center for addressing social issues, including hunger, homelessness, right? There are one point of contact we often have with families that have intensive needs. And how do we make sure that we're using data and enabling our systems to be agile in the moment, right? How can we adjust and pivot? Because right now it feels like 2020 will throw us any curveball it can. So even what we think we know for tomorrow might need to be adjusted. So how do we make sure we can do that in real time? And this is a slide Steve has shared multiple times, and I have found the word pivot has creeped into my vocabulary in so many different places. And I think this is a really central message, right? It's not that we're doing brand new and different. We're thinking about how do we change strategy without changing our goals, our vision, our mission. So how do we think about that we're not necessarily changing what we're doing? As an administrator, I heard talk just said recently, we're changing how we're doing it, right? So we're really thinking about a pivot of critical features, a pivot of critical systems, not changing the what, but the how, and making sure it is still mission driven and aligns with our vision. So with that, I wanted to pause the summary, and we will put slides back up again to have the evaluation QR code prompted. But I wanted to give us a chance to address some of the questions that came up. And I remember one of them for you, Steve, but I think you've also been looking at them. So I will start by asking you one, and then that'll give me a chance to peek unless you already have a couple. But the one that I had seen was just if you, and you did some of this already in the presentation, I think it came ahead of when you had shared some of the information, but if you could talk about like 3 things or a small number of things that Michigan has really leaned into to support districts and schools during this time.
Yeah, thank you. So a couple things that we have really focused on is to say we can't do things the same way we've done before. So when we lean in, we really focused on what are a few things that educators can do right now, and how can that be embedded in their current work or their previous work, so it's not like all brand new. So that's one thing. What's a practical, doable thing that they can do next? And Brandy helped us out with presentations on that, and she'll be doing another one coming up. Susan has, Nita Archer has. So those are available on our website, and I'll put that in the chat as well. Another thing that we focused on is to say, we're getting mixed messages across the country, across the state, on what should we be doing. Do we open schools? Do we close schools? Do we? And it's our numbers are increasing, so now even more information is coming out. So what we tried to do is to be consistent in messaging from the state down to the schools. So for example, opening up our work around supporting educators, we had our deputy superintendent provide the welcoming message and talking about why this is important and this is what you should focus on. The third thing is that we focus on how do you know if what you're doing is right and making a difference? And that can be as simple as just asking people, are you overwhelmed? Is this helping? Or looking at your data of your impact on the screeners. How do you do screening right now for, we use Acadience as a curriculum-based measure. How do you look at that? What are you looking for behavioral engagement or attendance? And so those are kind of the three main things. Looking at effective things that are doable, making sure that's aligned with support from the state, from the district on down. And the third is making sure that we are paying attention to saying if it's making a difference. What would you add to that, Brandy?
I think that was brilliant. I don't think I would add anything. So I have been peeking at questions as you were describing that. Do you want to address a couple of others? Do you want to throw one at me?
Yeah, so if you've seen some of the questions I haven't seen in the chat, so is there something you want to answer that you see?
One of the questions, and I want to answer this in part because I was multitasking and made a cute slide to, I think, address. So close your eyes for a second while I share, and then I will get it full screen. So I might be slightly ridiculously excited about The Mandalorian coming back on because that's one of our fun things to watch right now. The question was around how do you get staff excited about PBIS in the current context? And this, the saying that is often used in that show is "this is the way." And I grabbed that because one of the best examples I've seen around how do you get staff excited is around schools that just describe this as the way we are approaching everything, right? It's not that PBIS or MTSS is one more thing. It is the way we are doing all the things. So I really think about the emphasis, especially for districts and schools that have these systems built already and have practices installed. By doing this, we are actually making our daily lives better. We are improving the likelihood of students being successful. So there are lots of really good rationale reasons that we want to do this. But I think the messaging around it not being one more thing, it's not an add-on, it is the way we approach all of our work, becomes a really effective message, I think, for people to hear and to continue to come back to. Plus it was a chance to show Baby Yoda, or the child, I should say. But I do think it is that piece of how do we get folks kind of understanding that the MTSS framework is not brand new and different. It is the way of work. It's the way that our district and school approaches the work. So one of the other questions that I saw that I don't know, Steve, if you'd be willing to take, was around school administrators being concerned, and I think it's related to the same topic, that they're asking teachers to do so much. So as they're thinking about kind of everything on teachers' plates, especially given the local context, which might be remote or hybrid or in person, but all of it kind of in a new context, how do we help think about PBIS continuing as teachers and staff are stretched?
So I can start, but Brandy, please add in if that's okay. So for the first part is, as teachers and educators are stretched, we want to make sure we're very clear that here are the things that will be most effective in getting the outcomes. And those most effective things is to teach. So teach academic or teach behavior. We need to teach because there's been a lot of loss on that. So certainly for the behavior is, teaching the expectations around what that is, what it looks like, what it is in the different contexts. For the administrators to help support and not feel overwhelmed, one strategy that we're focusing on right now is we're running a series on what is the specific practice that educators can use on social emotional, on the behavior, on the academic. And then we are following that up to say, as an administrator, here's a quick video that you can watch that's 10 minutes that will say, your educators already attended this webinar. Here's a follow-up of how you can support their implementation of that effort. And so that's helping them to understand that you want to support them and you understand what's happening. And along with that would be like a resource or a checklist, or here's tools that educators or the administrators can use to further support what educators are going through. So Brandy, what would you add?
I think that's really helpful, is thinking about what are those things that we can hand educators to make this easier, and how do we build the systems to kind of understand where they're at, what they need, and also what's working and what's not. You know, I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that I feel like we've seen educators step up in amazing ways, and we've seen them compared to superheroes, but that's exhausting to maintain across time. So how do we make sure that in addition to thinking about what they need to do, that we're building systems that support them? So we're providing them the training and coaching they need, as Steve gave great examples for. We're giving them the tools they need. But in addition to that, we're celebrating successes with them, right? We're thinking about how do we kind of build and enhance their implementation and celebrate what they're already doing really well.
Brandy, there was a question around where can they find the examples of practice to support document. It's the page or the slide 25 in the PowerPoint, which really is the table from the Returning to School guide. And I don't know if you want to talk about that and the links that are in that.
Yeah, I will. When we conclude, I can actually throw a direct link to that document in chat, but it's available at the main webpage that we've showed a couple of times, and I believe the link to that is in chat. I also see a couple of very veteran folks that are with us, so if any of them want to throw it in chat as we're talking, that could also be really helpful. They've been doing that throughout, so that's fantastic. Thank you to Kathy. I just saw her at it. One of the questions that also came up that I have found pretty interesting is thinking about, as we've talked about evidence-based practice and the need to pivot those, how do we do that? And I shared this really briefly already, but I wanted to give a little bit more context. So when we developed the guide, as you saw, it was in June. And so we had learned a lot from the spring implementation, but we hadn't seen what school would look like this fall. And so we did our best to think about how do we help support that pivot. And so the process we went through is thinking about, for every practice, for every system feature, what are the critical features? So what are the non-negotiables that need to be there no matter what the implementation context? And then how do we make sure those critical features show up in whatever implementation context we're in? And the piece I shared really briefly was, I've had the benefit of watching amazing educators, one in particular that is my son's 4th grade teacher. And I'm going to pop a link into chat in Pathable right now that gives an example of what we are seeing in the classroom. And what was so reassuring to me about the implementation example was that it wasn't brand new and different. The things that made the classroom so effective were the same exact things that make a typical classroom in fall of 2019 so effective, right? It's seeing the routines, it's having a safe and effective environment. She has found ways that in this remote context, where in our district, they pulled kids across schools, so kids are in classrooms with kids they don't know. She found ways to create opportunities for them to develop friendships, for them to have great academic and instructional experiences. And the means she used are, again, not brand new and different. These are the same exact strategies that we talk about with routines, expectations, reinforcement with specific praise and other strategies. She also used data to guide her decisions around intervention and who needs what. and her data were Post-it notes. So we are not talking about this being hard and complex. We're talking about those simple things that we can do to capture what's going well, what's not going well, and adjust our practice back on that. So the article that I posted in chat will do a much better job than I just did in the 1-minute explanation, but it's a fantastic opportunity, I think, to learn from what this looks like in real time.
So Brandy, can I just share, if people are interested, the results of the poll that we have? So the question was, are you aware of the pbis.org resources? 86% said yes, 14% said no. Of the next question, have you accessed either through viewing or downloading the resources? 62 said yes, 26 said no, and 13% said they're not aware of the resources. The next question was, have you actually used the resources in the setting? 65% said yes, 10% said no, and 25% haven't accessed the resources. And finally, if you have used the resources, have they been helpful in supporting? 40% said very helpful, 21% said helpful, 5 said not sure, 2 said not helpful, and 32% have not accessed the resources. So that information is really, really helpful for us. So as we're considering what's needed and what has been working or not. So thank you.
That's fantastic. In our kind of private chat, we're having a little bit of debate because we were worried that the tech is going to cut us off. We think we have until 4:45 Eastern, but we're going to see if that's true. So if we lose you, we just want to proactively say thank you. But we think we have a couple more minutes. So if there are other questions, please let us know. And my personal favorite question so far is a comment that Baby Yoda needs a data systems and practices tattoo. I agree. You can imagine that will be coming to a PowerPoint near you soon. But we so appreciate all of the chat and the sharing of resources. And I think you have all seen this across sessions, but that continues to be available to you after the session. So as we might add a couple of links to just make sure you have access to our content, feel free to do that for each other. Or again, if you were in a prior session or the next 2 days, you want to be able to go back and see a link or see something, those should all be available. So thank you again to everyone who has continued to engage. And I think Steve and I will stay on at least until 4:45 Eastern or whatever time zone you're in to take questions. I'm going to also remind.
And I lost the chat too, so I don't see it. What's in it?
Oh no. I'm going to remind us that we would love feedback on this session. And I'm going to put up the evaluation link. It's also available under the Files pod. So if you don't have it, your phone ready to go with the QR code, just we would, again, appreciate the data to guide our practice in the future. So please take the few minutes to do an eval. They're really quick. And as I'm sharing, I lose access to chat. Steve, are you able to see the chat? Because Anthony mentioned there's a question about Swiss and how we can use that to monitor practice, but I can't see the full text unless I stop sharing.
My chat went away, so I apologize.
Okay,
Yeah.
so sorry, I'll stop. Actually, I can still share this version and step on my desktop. So one of the questions that I just saw, and again, we're a little unclear when we're going to get kicked out, but was around thinking about supporting all students with a small number of practices, but then thinking about what that means for populations like multi-language learners or students with different abilities. And I will just kind of redirect that quickly to say that there are fantastic resources that are in the PowerPoint around intensifying practices for students with more intensive behavioral needs. That's not going to address all components of that question, but for sure we continue to need the full continuum of support. And we talked primarily in this about the systems pieces and the practices primarily at tier 1, but there are great resources there around tier 2 and tier 3. There's also an entire strand on that. So if you're not signed up for that one and wish you had, you are always welcome to check back in and catch those resources after they've been recorded. So our hope is that folks continue to engage with this conference or forum long after it is over, because everything will be available up online. So with that, I'm thinking, Steve, that we're going to officially wrap up. And if there are questions that are in the chat that we've missed, because we've both been multitasking a little bit to try and make sure we can share presentations, let us know. And thank you all. Have a great conference.